Hey guys, so today has been fucking chaotic. I mean, I've had 4 classes today, my first full day of uni because yesterday I slept through my fucking alarm. But to be fair, I had a flight the day before, so fair enough. Also, look at these new gloves I got. They're supposed to be like bat-shaped, but I don't think you can see it. But I also got this bat-themed necklace, which actually does look like a bat. As you can tell, I love bats, as you can see by the amount of posters on my wall. Tomorrow I'm also getting these LED little bat decorations, like the little stickers, like little bats that I can just put on my wall, and it's gonna be fucking incredible, mate. Mate. Also, yes, I am gonna get a new camera, and I'm gonna get a LED fucking ring light, so no more of this horrible MacBook video software. But enough about me. Today I wanted to talk about a subject that is very dear to my heart, Dan and Phil. And this isn't an outsider perspective. I've seen so many videos where it's people speaking from an outsider perspective about Dan and Phil. But no, girl, I was in the fucking trenches. I was a die-hard fan for years. I still love them. I have a Dan and Phil calendar. I'm subscribed to their Patreon. Unless my funds get a little low, then I'll have to probably unsubscribe. But it's nothing on you, Dan and Phil. I'm in uni. So the topic I would like to talk about today in relation to Dan and Phil is about their branding and also how they've retained an audience that's still loyal to them. And to prove I'm not a poser, let me give you a bit of my history. I've been to the Terrible Influence Tour. I've been to Dan Howell's comedy show. Phil liked 2 of my posts on Twitter. I got a voice message from Phil, not in like my DMs. It was on some like app. I got signed versions of Dan Howell's book. Also, when I had a Dan and Phil Instagram fan account, I had one of my posts be in his Instagram videos. I don't remember which one, but it was in one of them. Also, he answered one of my questions in one of his videos. So yeah, me, Dan and Phil go way back. I do have 2 copies of The Amazing Book Is Not on Fire and Dan and Phil Go Outside. Unfortunately, I do not have them with me because they're back home. But those books are a really good source of analyzing I can't fucking speak. The extent of their branding. And I think their branding really peaked around the mid-2010s. And it kind of followed a trope. A trope that I think drew more people to romanticize their relationship. Or more so speculate because they weren't out about their relationship at the time. But now they are, and I can see they're trying to remove themselves from their original branding, but we'll talk more about that later. So in the mid-2010s, Dan and Phil really came up with this branding for themselves. Dan was the dark and edgy one, the sarcastic one. He wore all black like me, bitch. Can you tell I watched Dan and Phil? He made dirty jokes. He was offensive in his language. He loved llamas. That was a big thing. Like, Dan was into llamas. Ooh, that sounds a bit weird. Dan liked llamas, Phil liked lions. It was a whole thing. Lions and llamas, black and blue. That branding was featured a lot in fan songs. Llamas, lions, black and blue. Llamas, lions, cabela's too. And if I'm remembering this correctly, in their Amazing Book Is Not on Fire books, they literally had sections dedicated to llamas, lions. And then on the contrast to Dan, Phil was like the innocent one, the beam of sunshine. He wore colors, unlike Dan, who only wore black. He was kind and gentle and didn't curse, unlike Dan, the fucking cunt apparently. He's such an innocent small bean, he would never say anything dirty. And that idea formulated by the fandom is why I love in their modern podcasts how Phil's swearing. Phil's like saying dirty shit. And I'm like, period. But yes, the trope that I connect Dan and Phil with in this era of their branding is Grumpy and Sunshine. A classic Wattpad trope, which is what most of the Dan and Phil fanfictions followed. Punk and pastel, bad boy and soft boy. But it's this trope connected to their branding that I think really made fans be like, they're such a power couple, Grumpy and Sunshine, edgy and innocent, and this brand really carried them through. They presented themselves as polar opposites. However, they were alike in many ways. They both had matching haircuts. People thought they were fucking brothers. Half of my friends that didn't watch Dan and Phil thought they were fucking brothers because of their matching haircut. And the way they dressed with like the t-shirts and the skinny jeans, very ex-emo look. And they were both nerdy, a bit alternative, fun. And many weird kids could relate to that. I certainly did. I related immensely to both of them. And because of this appeal, they had a very weird kid, alternative, queer audience. And when people make videos about Dan and Phil, they usually lean towards the parasocial of it all, the speculation of their relationship and how the internet did them wrong. And while those are very good points to bring up, I'm going to talk about something different. During the time of Dan and Phil's peak popularity around the 2010s, they sometimes got grouped in with the Brit Crew. And while the Brit Crew fell off and stopped making videos together, Dan and Phil persisted. And you could separate Dan and Phil from the Brit Crew because they were different. They were weird, they were alternative, they were nerds. And because of their characters, or their personalities, they amassed a very specific loyal audience. I remember when Dan and Phil were on hiatus, and even during the hiatus, there was a strong Dan and Phil fan base. And I know this because I was on Twitter at the time. I would be getting thousands of likes from Dan and Phil fans in 2020. And it's because they were so different. They were so unique in their branding. They were so unique in their personalities. I don't think I've seen many other YouTubers have that specific of a branding, that specific of a niche personality. And I'm not saying Dan and Phil are niche because they're definitely very popular, but I'm saying they attracted a very specific audience that would continue to be loyal. And also, they're unproblematic. I don't want to jinx that, but they've stayed consistently unproblematic throughout their entire career. And even after their hiatus, where they were gone for years, they still had an audience. And that's really impressive, I think. Because a lot of YouTubers from that era, they don't really have an audience anymore, but Dan and Phil still get an audience. And the community that they have formed has been long-lasting. And because they've had such a long-lasting audience, their audience is older now. They're like young adults. And these people are still watching Dan and Phil. And they're really loving the new content with Dan and Phil because they're older. And Dan and Phil have really opened up more, been more vulnerable. And while in the 2010s, they were put in these little boxes of their branding, in recent years, they've shown more of their true selves. And I think them opening up about being a couple really expanded that for them. I remember being in the queue for Dan and Phil tickets to see Terrible Influence last year, and there were so many people in the queue. I almost didn't get tickets because there were that many fucking people wanting to see a Dan and Phil show in 2024. Actually, I think it was 2025. My concept of time is a bit off. Jesus, it's 2026. Oof. But going back to the branding, because Dan and Phil have opened up more and they're more comfortable now in their personalities and how they're being perceived, their original branding has gone out the fucking door, babes. They were trapped in their branding, they were trapped in the closet, and then bam! They were more authentic, and they still had a loyal community. And I really appreciate how they've separated themselves from the fandom's past perceptions about them. Like, no, they're not this Grumpy and Sunshine couple, duo, whatever. They're Dan and Phil. Not the characters of the edgy one and the innocent one, but instead, they're themselves. They're authentically themselves in 2026, and that's incredible. And I think authenticity and change is what really drives an audience to stay. Those are my concluding thoughts about Dan and Phil's branding and their audience and how it all is intertwined. Because they do still have a branding. Every YouTuber, every influencer has a certain branding, but it's changed, and their audience has changed, and change can be a good thing. I want to end this by showing you guys my Dan and Phil cosplays. Because I actually did buy a brown wig and a black wig, both in the emo style. So attention everyone, this is my 2009 Dan and Phil cosplay. So this is Phil. Serving Pin-Off 1. You can see my fucking ponytail in the back, but I can't be asked. And this is Dan. Hello internet. Serving Dan is not on fire. Chic. Also, I feel this is appropriate. If this doesn't wash off, oh my god, imagine I go to uni tomorrow and I'm just walking around in fucking cat whiskers. Honestly, kind of camp. Rorexty. So yeah, shout out to Dan and Phil, shout out to their podcast, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.
The internet is here. The internet is great. When you've got lots of followers, who needs a real man?